Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here, and today I want to show you a cool trick that allows you to select both your shutter speed and aperture while the camera uses ISO to automatically generate a proper exposure. I use this little gem all the time for wildlife in action, and I hope it can help you as well. In fact, it's just one of the hundreds of tips in my upcoming wildlife photography ebook, so stay tuned for that. Now, before we get started, I want to mention that not every camera is going to support the little trick we're about to discuss. Now, pretty much every modern Nikon DSLR does support this, as well as a few of the newer higher-end Canon models. And other manufacturers will support it to varying degrees. So you'll have to test it with your camera to see if it actually works as I'm about to describe. Also, this is one of those methods that I personally really like, but I know it's not for everyone. We all have our own styles and preferences, and when it comes to exposure modes, there is certainly more than one way to skin that poor proverbial cat. With those caveats out of the way, let's quickly review how exposure actually works before we get started. Now, we know that in order to create a proper exposure, you have basically three factors you need to consider. You have your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. These three combined give you a proper exposure, and you can lock in any of the two and vary the third to create that proper exposure. Now, we also know we have some exposure modes in our cameras that allow us to control how these three factors interact. Normally, we set the ISO to a fixed value and then choose one of four exposure modes, either program, aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual. Now, as you probably know, these modes are primarily designed around having you or the camera controlling either the shutter speed, aperture, or both. ISO is generally left out of the equation and really thought of as more of a fixed value. However, that doesn't need to be the case. In the film days, we were stuck with the ISO of whatever film we happened to have in the camera at the time, but today ISO is as variable and as easy to change as f-stops and shutter speeds. So why not use ISO as the exposure variable set by the camera instead of shutter speed or aperture? Think about how cool that would be. Imagine an exposure mode where you and I get to set the exact shutter speed and f-stop we want for a given scene. You know, the important stuff, and the camera adjusts the ISO to generate a proper exposure. Think of it like aperture or shutter priority, only instead of the camera adjusting the shutter speed or f-stop for you, now it's adjusting the ISO. Plus, since the camera is already set up to allow us to quickly change things like shutter speed and aperture, and generally much faster than we can change ISO, we never need to look away from the viewfinder and can react almost instantaneously to a change in the scene. It beats the heck out of manually fumbling with the ISO every time we need to bump in speed, right? Now, this exposure mode doesn't have a convenient label like our other exposure modes do, but in many cameras, it's still there, kind of lurking in the shadows, and it's actually pretty easy to use. You just turn on Auto ISO and flip your exposure mode to manual. Now, I know, at first this seems a bit odd. After all, didn't I just say it was an auto mode like aperture or shutter priority? So why are we in manual mode? Don't worry, it's still automatic. The exposure mode may say manual on the camera, but as long as you have Auto ISO turned on, the camera will adjust your ISO automatically to maintain proper exposure, just like it would adjust, say, your shutter speed automatically if you were in aperture priority mode. The difference is, instead of you setting ISO and f-stop and letting the camera choose shutter speed, again, like in aperture priority, for example, now you are the one setting shutter speed and f-stop and letting the camera choose the appropriate ISO based on the light levels. In fact, I'll show you exactly how to set this up on a Nikon camera later in this video, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Now, you might be thinking, why not just use Auto ISO with one of the normal exposure modes? First off, for those who don't know, most cameras support a feature called Auto ISO that allows you to set in a minimum shutter speed as well as a maximum and minimum ISO range. Once set, the camera will adjust your ISO so that the minimum shutter speed you choose is always maintained unless it gets so dark you cap out on the maximum ISO setting you told the camera you wanted to use, in which case it will generally just drop the shutter speed. Here's my problem with this. I have to pick a minimum shutter speed. Sometimes I don't need excessive speed, and I never want to be shooting at a higher ISO than necessary, though. I always want to shoot with the lowest possible ISO, and actually I have three big reasons for this. Number one, and this is the most obvious one, everyone knows this, it's noise. Why put up with more noise than needed to get a sharp photo? If I can get a sharp photo at, say, 1/25th of a second, I'm not really gaining anything by cranking my ISO up and going to 1,000th of a second, right? Number two, As your ISO increases, your dynamic range decreases. This means that shadows are going to get blocky much faster and highlights are going to get blown out much sooner than they would at a lower ISO. And number 3, finally, as ISO increases, color fidelity actually tends to decrease, so lower ISOs generally have better colors. Back to the auto ISO problem. If I'm setting a minimum shutter speed, I know I'll have to set high in case I run into some good action. So let's say I set my minimum shutter speed at 1/1000th of a second under my auto ISO menu. That's great for a flying, leaping, or running animal, but it's probably 2 to 3 stops faster than I really need if I happen to be photographing a stationary animal. So do I go in and lower the minimum shutter speed for stationary animals? If I do, and an animal decides to burst into action, there's no way for me to get things set back fast enough. And that's why I generally don't use regular auto ISO. Now let's look at how it works when using our manual mode with auto ISO method that we're talking about. For example, let's say I'm photographing a wading bird out in a pond. It's stationary, so I only need, say, 1/250th of a second to get a nice sharp photo. We'll also say I'm shooting f4, so I can keep a nice clean background. So I knock my shutter speed down to 2/50th of a second, I open my lens to f4. The camera automatically moves my ISO down to, say, 200 to maintain a proper exposure. Now as time goes on, I can tell my bird is just about ready to take off. Now for birds in flight, 1/250th of a second is probably going to be a little too slow, so I move my shutter speed up to 1/1000th of a second just to be safe. I'd also like a little more depth of field in case my autofocus isn't quite as spot on as I'd like it to be, so I stop down to f5.6. With this method, the camera instantaneously and automatically resets my ISO up 3 stops to 1600 from where it was before at ISO 200. Again, the real advantage here is that both shutter speed and f-stop are controlled by the dials right there on my camera, right by my fingers. So making those changes is nearly instantaneous. I didn't need to stop and fiddle with my ISO buttons. Plus, this works just like any other automatic mode. Let's say I'm shooting first thing in the morning and I have my camera set to 1/250th at f4. So the camera sets the ISO to, say, 3200 for a proper exposure because it's kind of dark. As the day gets brighter, my ISO will naturally fall to lower levels without my intervention. I just need to set my f-stop and shutter speed and the camera takes care of the rest. Like I said, it's just like aperture priority or shutter priority, only this time the camera is generating a correct exposure by floating the ISO values. Let's take a look at the setup for a Nikon camera right now. Okay, before we get started, keep in mind that although this setup is for Nikon, most other cameras will have a similar setup procedure if they support this technique. So check your manual for specific instructions on how to set up auto ISO. We'll go over how to check if your non-Nikon camera can do it right after this brief Nikon setup. So the first thing we need to do is to set our camera into manual mode, and that's easy enough to do. Now let's go into our menu area and select the shooting menu. Scroll down until you find ISO sensitivity settings and go ahead and select that. Now let's go ahead and turn on auto ISO. Just select auto ISO and then select on from the resulting screen. Now let's set our minimum ISO. This ISO will be the lowest you allow the camera to go. I usually go to the base ISO of the camera for this one. That's the one just before you start getting into those low settings you see there. Next, let's set the maximum ISO. Now this is my D810 and I like to keep this camera at no more than ISO 3200, so that's what I'm going to go ahead and set with mine. Now just go ahead and pick the maximum ISO you can tolerate for whatever camera you're using. That's about it. Note that there is a setting for minimum shutter speed here. Now it's really important that you know that this setting is totally ignored by Nikon cameras when you are in manual mode. They are not going to use it at all in that mode, so it really doesn't matter what it's set for. This shutter speed is only going to come into play if you're using a regular auto exposure mode like, say, aperture priority or program. And that's it. Your Nikon is all set and ready to go. What about non-Nikons? My advice is to set your camera up with manual mode and auto ISO, kind of like we just did, and then, just see if it works. Once you have it set up, simply turn on your info screen or look at the ISO values your camera is giving you as you point at different light sources. If your ISO value is changing as you point to lighter and darker areas and shutter speed and aperture are constant, then congratulations, your camera can do this little trick. Okay, now there are a couple of items with this method you do need to be aware of. As we mentioned, although the camera mode is manual, once auto ISO is set, it's really not in full manual mode anymore. As such, what happens when you need to, say, over or underexpose? It's simple. You actually use exposure compensation in manual mode. So let's do an example. Let's say you're photographing a black bear. There's a lot of black in the frame, a lot of bear in the frame, and when I do that, I generally like to underexpose by a stop, maybe 1.5 stops. So I'll just dial in my exposure compensation the same way I would if I were shooting in any other auto exposure mode. So pretty easy. The only downside is that, at least in my Nikons, the exposure compensation does not show up along the meter gauge in the viewfinder like it does with, say, aperture or shutter priority. So you do need to remember that you dial that exposure compensation in. The other issue that comes in is when you start to run out of light in the evening. My Nikons won't go beyond my max ISO setting, so if I have too much shutter speed or too small an aperture, it will actually start to underexpose when the light gets too dim. So you really need to keep a close eye on it as light levels fall to make sure you aren't underexposing the shot. Now the nice thing is that in this case, the exposure meter in the viewfinder will show you this underexposure so you can lower your shutter speed or open your lens as needed as the light gets dimmer. So that's the trick. It may not be for everyone, and I understand that, but I recommend giving it a try and seeing if it's something that works well for you. It's a super great trick to have in your photographic toolbox, in my opinion. Again, this video was based off of just one of the hundreds of tips and tricks you're going to find in my upcoming wildlife photography ebook. So please make sure you stop by my site and sign up for my email newsletter so you'll know when that book is available, as well as when I release any of these new videos. Finally, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and hey, have a great day.